Hello. In this video, we'll look at how to run a containerized application on Google Kubernetes Engine Autopilot. Specifically, though, we're going to focus on how to have a really lean, easy, and performant networking setup by using some of the CRDs that are provided by the service. When we do that, we'll be taking advantage of, in a very turnkey way, Google's Certificate Manager service for automated TLS certificates and custom domains, along with the performance and scale of Google's global HTTP load balancing. At the cluster level, we'll be able to use standard Kubernetes objects like services and deployments to run and expose our application. With what we're trying to achieve now established, let's jump into the Google Cloud Console and quickly set up these resources. We'll also provide all code that we use today in the description of this video. The first thing I'm going to do is go to Kubernetes Engine and enable the API. With the API now enabled, we'll be able to create our cluster, and the defaults should all be fine here. The most notable of these is that we use a public cluster, which means the Kubernetes API will be reachable from our IDE. We will still be able to control and secure our applications even in this case. With the defaults all looking good, let's go ahead and create. The nice part about these autopilot clusters is that you don't have to worry about Kubernetes nodes. Normally with Kubernetes, whether you're running it yourself or on something like standard GKE, you have to manage these nodes and node pools, and making sure that these are running well and optimized adds a bit of operational overhead. We get to avoid that entirely with this GKE Autopilot approach. Now, while that cluster provisions, we're going to take care of just two things that we need outside of the Kubernetes ecosystem for our application. The first thing we want is an IP address, so we're going to search for that and then provision one in the console here. Just be sure that this is a global IPv4 IP address. Then with this IP, take it and in your DNS provider for whatever domain that you'd like to use, add this as an A record. You can use whatever DNS provider that you'd like. We're going to use Cloud DNS on a separate screen here and just add our A record. So I've now added that in a DNS zone. I've pointed example.notomatic.io, which is our custom domain, to this IP address with an A record. That's all we need for the pieces outside of the autopilot cluster. We have our IP and we have our DNS record. Once this cluster finishes provisioning, then we'll be able to complete the networking setup with some resource deployments. In fact, we can get started on these resource files in our IDE here while we wait for that cluster to provision. We're going to use the Cloud Shell IDE, but of course, you can use your preferred development environment. We're going to start with the basics here for standard service and deployment configuration, and we're going to use Nginx as a simple example. We've got our Nginx container that we're going to deploy with a deployment resource, and we're going to use a single replica without auto-scaling. The deployment and service here are pretty standard. We just used a node port service type here so that our load balancer, which will be automatically provisioned shortly, will be able to see the service. Next up, we need to add some networking on top of this, which is going to use some of those resources we just provisioned, the IP and DNS. So we're calling this ingress example, and we're supplying the name for the IP that we created. Importantly, this name needs to match exactly. We're going to create a front-end configuration for HTTP to HTTPS redirects in just a moment, and we're also going to use Google Cloud's Managed Certificate Service to be able to have an SSL certificate. We're providing a default backend here, but note that we could have much more complex routing across multiple services. For example, we can introduce a rules block that has other service routes based on the path. Next up, let's add those last couple of resources for the certificate and the front-end configuration. Now, note that this front-end configuration is a GKE-specific custom resource definition, so this may be new to a lot of viewers. All this does, though, is provide a little bit of additional configuration for our ingress objects. In this case, we're leveraging it just to be able to have an automated HTTP to HTTPS redirect. And for the managed certificate, all we need is the domain that we're going to be using. Google will handle that certificate for us using HTTP ACME challenges. That's actually all that we need. And so if I switch over, it looks like we have our Autopilot cluster provisioned and we can apply this resource. The first thing I need to do is authenticate our kubectl client with the cluster, and then we'll apply these resources. The main thing to watch here is our managed certificate, since this is going to be the main prerequisite for the networking. If you've already set up the IP and DNS, this should provision on its own, and it should do so within a few minutes. However, keep in mind that if the provisioning is taking much longer than that, you may want to check out your DNS configuration to make sure it's properly configured. We also may want to check out the ingress resource to make sure it's provisioning as we expect, since if it's not, a load balancer will not be set up, and therefore our certificate and associated ACME challenge will not be created. So far, the events here are looking pretty good. We can actually check the ingress provisioning through the Cloud Console by going to Load Balancers, since this is what backs those ingress resources. From here, we can see our HTTP to HTTPS redirect, as well as our managed certificate. And now that our certificate is showing as active, we can go ahead and test out our new website. We've got our website showing up with our custom domain and also an SSL certificate. So we've got all these pieces here for a nice, production-grade, and highly performant networking setup for our containerized application with no need to manage nodes or other low-level details, and much of this will be managed automatically for us. The certificate, for example, will be automatically renewed, and the load balancing here is entirely serverless and Google managed. We hope this gives you a nice framework for networking your containerized applications with GKE Autopilot, and we'll watch the comments section for any questions. Thank you for watching.